Hello, and welcome to this tech tip from Will. In this tech tip, I will be looking at features on demand for Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. I will start by providing an overview of features on demand and will discuss what the feature is and why you would want to use it. And later, I will use my Windows Server 2012 R2 server to demonstrate how to use features on demand. So let's get started. First of all, what exactly is Features on Demand? Features on Demand is a brand new feature that was first introduced with Windows Server 2012 and remains available for Windows Server 2012 R2. Features on Demand, in a nutshell, allows an administrator to remove the install files and binaries that are required to install roles and features onto a server. But what exactly do I mean by this? To better understand features on demand, consider the following. Imagine that you have a server. On this server, you install a copy of either Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2. When the Windows Server operating system is first installed, straight out of the box, it is very basic by design. To add functionality to the server, the administrator is required to install what are called roles and features. The roles and features you install on your server will depend entirely on how you plan to use the server. For instance, if you plan to make the server a domain controller, then you would have to install the Active Directory Domain Services role. Likewise, if you intend to make the server a DNS or maybe a DHCP server, then you would have to install the DNS and DHCP server roles. In a nutshell, roles and features are programs that add functionality to Windows servers. When Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 is first installed, during the installation, Windows will copy all of the install files and binaries required by every role and feature from the installation media to the server. This includes the install files for Active Directory, DNS, DHCP, Hyper-V, IIS, and Wins, just to name a few. These install files are copied to the C Windows Win SXS directory. In Microsoft literature, this directory is commonly referred to as the Windows Side-by-Side Store, and the install files themselves are known as the payload. When the administrator installs a role or feature, Windows will obtain all of the install files it needs from the Side-by-Side Store. For example, if you have a server that requires the Hyper-V role, Windows will, by default, obtain the Hyper-V install files from its local side-by-side store. This is why Windows never prompts you to provide your Windows installation media when you install roles or features, since the files are already present on the server. With Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2, Features on Demand gives the administrator the option to remove any install files, or payloads if you prefer, from the side-by-side store that you have no use for. In other words, if you have no plans to install a particular role or feature, you are able to remove the payload for that role or feature from the side-by-side store. For instance, in the case of my Hyper-V server, I could remove the Active Directory, DNS, DHCP, IIS, and Wins payloads from my side-by-side store if I wanted, since none of these roles are installed, nor do I have any intention of installing them. This is all very well, but it does beg a couple of questions. Namely, why would you want to do this? And what exactly are the benefits to removing the payloads? These are good questions, so let's look at this now. Removing payloads from the side-by-side store that are not required provides two key benefits. First, the act of removing these files will, unsurprisingly, free up disk space on your server. Depending on the number of payloads you plan to remove, you could free anything up to 2 GB of disk space. By itself, you may not think that this is reason enough to warrant removing the payloads, which brings me to the second reason. Removing payloads, believe it or not, is actually a form of security. By removing unnecessary payloads, you are effectively reducing the amount of software you have on your server. From a security standpoint, the more software you have on a server, the larger its attack surface will be. In other words, the more software you have, the more vulnerabilities there are for an attacker to exploit. By removing payloads that aren't required, you are effectively reducing the amount of software that is present on your server, and are therefore increasing its security. Of course, this now begs another question. You may be wondering, well, what if I change my mind? Is it possible to install a role or feature after removing its payload? Quite simply, the answer is yes. You can still install a role or feature onto a server, even if its payload has been removed from the side-by-side store. In cases like this, the administrator is, at the time of role installation, required to specify an alternate location that does contain the files. When you attempt to install a role or feature that's payload has been removed from the side-by-side store, Windows will ask you to manually specify a path to the install files. This could be the Windows Server 2012 installation media, or even a network share called a feature file store that contains the files. Later on in the video, I will show you both methods. If you do not specify an alternate location manually, Windows will, instead, consult Group Policy, specifically the Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, System, Specify Settings for Optional Component Installation and Component Repair policy. With this group policy, you are able to specify the path to a network share that contains the install files. This saves the administrator from having to specify the path manually, and can be useful if you have a lot of servers on the network. The last place Windows will attempt to obtain the install files from is Windows Update. If your server is connected to the internet, the payload files can be downloaded from Microsoft servers. This is enabled by default. Of course, if the server does not have an internet connection, this will instantly fail. It is worth noting at this point that it is possible, using the group policy I mentioned earlier, to disable this functionality and prevent payload files being downloaded from the internet. This is the most secure option. As you can see, there is rather a lot to Features on Demand, so let's take a look at how it works. To demonstrate how Features on Demand works, I will, in my lab environment, deploy 2 Windows Server 2012 R2 servers, named DC1 and Server 1. DC1 is the domain controller and DNS server for my network. Server 1 is a member server that I will use to demonstrate Features on Demand. Both servers have been assigned static IP addresses of 192.168.1.1 and 192.168.1.2. I will now change over to my Server 1 server to show you how Features on Demand works. This is my Server 1 server. To begin with, I will show you the Windows side-by-side store. So I will first open File Explorer. Next, I will open the C drive, followed by the Windows folder. From here, if I scroll down through the list of folders, notice that we have a folder named WinSXS. This is the Windows side-by-side store that contains the payloads for every server role and feature. When you install a role or feature, this is where Windows obtains the install files. If I open the WinSXS folder, you can see that there are, quite literally, thousands of items in this directory. I will now go back to the root of File Explorer. To demonstrate the space savings you can achieve by removing non-required payloads, I will right-click on my C drive and will select Properties. In the Used Space section, notice that this installation of Windows Server 2012 R2 is just over 9 GB. After removing the payloads, I will expect the amount of disk space used by the operating system to be reduced. I will now close File Explorer and will return to my desktop. From here, I will open Windows PowerShell. Next, I will run the commandlet Get-WindowsFeature. When I run this command, PowerShell will list every role and every feature offered by Windows Server 2012. If I scroll up and down through the list, you can see that there are a lot of roles and features. In the left column, you can see the names of the roles and features. Meanwhile, in the right column, you can see the install state for the roles and features. There are 3 different install states: available, installed, and removed. Available means that the binaries for the role are present in the side-by-side store. However, the role is not currently installed on the server. Any role or feature that has a status of available is eligible to have its payload removed with minimal fuss. The install state, as the name suggests, means that the binaries are present in the side-by-side store, but also means that the role is installed on the server. Understand, any role or feature that has an install state of installed is eligible to have its payload removed. However, since the feature is already installed, you are first required to uninstall it before its payload can be removed. The final install state is removed. The removed state means that the binaries for the role or feature are not present on the server and have already been removed from the side-by-side store. So, how do we go about removing the payloads for roles and features that we have no need for? Well, there are a couple of ways. The first method is to remove the payloads one at a time. This method is best used if you only want to remove a handful of payloads. For instance, if I wanted to remove just the wireless LAN service and the Windows Server backup features, which are both currently available, I can achieve this by running the command Uninstall-WindowsFeature, followed by the name switch, and the names of the 2 features, which in this case are wireless networking and Windows Server backup. Lastly, I will add the remove switch. The remove switch instructs Windows not just to uninstall the features, but to completely strip out the payloads from the side-by-side store. If I run this command, PowerShell will start to remove the payloads for both features. Depending on the number of features you have selected, this may take a few moments to complete. When the command does complete, notice that I have received a prompt stating that the removal was a success. These payloads should now be removed from the side-by-side store, so let's find out. Once again, I will run the commandlet Get-WindowsFeature. At the bottom of the list, notice that the install state for both the wireless LAN service and Windows Server Backup has changed to removed, suggesting their payloads are no longer present in the side-by-side store. So, since the payloads have been removed, what happens if I try to install one of these features? Well, let's find out. If I run the Uninstall-WindowsFeature commandlet to install a role or feature, and then add the name switch, followed by the feature wireless networking for the wireless LAN service, notice that, initially, PowerShell will start to install the feature. However, after a short while, the installation will eventually fail. If you look closely at the resulting error message, notice the result that PowerShell gave us. The source files could not be downloaded. This proves that the payloads have, in fact, been removed. This is all very well, but to remove the payloads for every single role and feature like this, one at a time, would take a very long time and simply isn't practical. Microsoft has thought about this and has provided a PowerShell script which, when run, will remove the payloads for every role and feature that is not currently installed on the server. In other words, the payloads for every role or feature that you are not using and that have an install state of available will be removed. The script is rather long and complex. To make things easier for you, I will place a copy of the script in the description of this video. Feel free to copy the command if you require it. First, I will enter the commandlet Get-WindowsFeature, followed by a space and the pipe symbol and another space. Next, I will enter the command where_object and will then add the switch FilterScript. Next, leave a space, enter an opening curly bracket, and then leave another space. You then need to enter the following symbols: $, underscore, and a dot, followed immediately by the word installed. Leave a space and then add the switch EQ. Leave another space, enter a $, and then the word false. You should then leave another space and finish with a closing curly bracket. Next, leave a space, enter another pipe symbol, followed by another space. Then enter the command Uninstall-WindowsFeature, and finally add the remove switch. When you look at this command, it can seem a little daunting. Essentially, what the command is saying is, gather up all of the roles and features that aren't installed on this server and remove their payloads. When I run the command, PowerShell will start to remove all payloads belonging to roles and features that have not been installed. Any roles and features that are installed on the server will not be affected. Since there are a lot of roles and features that aren't installed on this server, the script will take a number of minutes to run, so I will skip to the end. The payloads have now been removed. To show you the end result, I will once again run the PowerShell commandlet Get-WindowsFeature. As you can see, this time the output of the command is very different. Most of the roles and features are now reporting an install state of removed, indicating that their payloads are no longer present in the side-by-side store. To prove this, let's take another look at our used disk space. If I open File Explorer, right-click on my C drive, and select Properties, you can see that the amount of used space has, in fact, decreased. By removing the payloads, I have reclaimed about 1 GB of disk space on this server. So I will close the Properties screen and will return to File Explorer. Now, the big question you are probably asking is, what if I change my mind? How do I install a role or feature after removing its payload? Well, since the payloads have been removed from the side-by-side store, the only way to achieve this is to obtain the binaries from an alternate source. The alternate source can be either the Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 installation DVD, a network share called a feature file store, or even Windows Update. If you have just 1 or 2 servers, you will most likely just use the Windows DVD. So let me start by showing you how to do this. If you have your Windows Server 2012 installation DVD, insert it into the server and open File Explorer. It is worth noting at this point that if you are using Windows Server 2012, you should use a Windows Server 2012 installation DVD. Likewise, if you are using Windows Server 2012 R2, you should use a Windows Server 2012 R2 DVD. As you can see, I have already inserted my Windows Server 2012 R2 installation disk into my server's D drive. If I open the DVD and then open the Sources folder, if I scroll down through the list of files, notice that we have a file named Install.wim. This is the file that contains the Windows Server 2012 R2 operating system that was used when I first installed the operating system. To get a closer look at the Install.wim file, I will close File Explorer and will return to PowerShell. From here, I will issue the command dism, which is a tool used for managing WIM files. Next, I will add the switches get WIM info and WIM file. I will then enter the path to the install.wim file, which, in my case, is d sources install.wim. After a short wait, PowerShell will interrogate the install.wim file and will provide a list of images contained in the file. In my case, there are 4 images. 2 of the images are for Windows Server 2012 R2 standard installations, whereas the other 2 images are for Windows Server 2012 R2 data center installations. Notice that each image has an index number to identify it. Since I am using Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard Edition with a full graphical user interface, the image I am interested in is Index 2, Windows Server 2012 R2 Server Standard. Now that I know the index number of my image, I will close Windows PowerShell and will reopen Server Manager. From here, I will select the Add Roles and Features link to launch the Add Roles and Features wizard. I will then next my way through to the Select Server Roles page. From the list of roles, I will select to install the Fax Server role, and will then next my way through to the end of the wizard. Notice, at the top of the wizard, I have received a warning prompt stating that one or more installation selections are missing source files. I am receiving this error because, if you recall, the binaries for the Fax Server role were removed from the side-by-side store when I ran the PowerShell script earlier. If I were to click the Install button now, the installation will fail. To install the Fax Server role, I need to obtain the binaries from an alternate source. If you look at the bottom of the wizard, notice we have a link. Specify an alternate source path. If I click on this link, this will open the Specify Alternate Source Path dialog box. From here, I can enter the path to the install.wim file on my Windows DVD. To start with, enter wim : followed by the path which, in my case, is d sources install.wim. And finally, I will add :2. This ensures that the binaries are extracted from the index 2 image on my DVD. I will then click the OK button, followed by the Install button. The Fax Server role is now being installed using the binaries from my Windows Server 2012 R2 DVD. It is worth noting at this point that not only is the role being installed, but the payloads for the Fax Server role are actually being added back into the local side-by-side store. This should only take a moment to complete. The Fax Server role has now finished installing, so I will close all open windows and will return to my desktop. Next, I will reopen Windows PowerShell and will run the command Get-WindowsFeature. If I scroll up through the list of features, notice that the Fax Server role is reporting an install state of installed, proving that the role is installed and its payload is back in the side-by-side store. To demonstrate this even further, I will now uninstall the Fax Server role. Only this time, I will not add the remove switch I showed you earlier. After uninstalling the role, if I then run the commandlet Get-WindowsFeature and then scroll up to the Fax Server role, notice that the Fax Server install state is now available, proving unequivocally that the binaries are back in the side-by-side store. I will now close Windows PowerShell and will return to my desktop. Although the Windows DVD is a straightforward way to do this if you have just one server, if you work for a large organisation with a lot of servers, you may, instead, wish to create a network share called a feature file store that contains the necessary payloads. You can then use group policy to point your servers to the feature file store to obtain the payloads they require. To do this, I will need to create a shared folder on another server. So I will now change over to my DC1 server to show you how to create a feature file store network share. This is my DC1 server. Before I create the feature file store, I would first like to raise an important point. First, I will open File Explorer. As you can see, I have inserted my Windows Server 2012 R2 installation DVD into the server's D drive. If I open the DVD and then open the folder Sources, notice that we have a folder named SXS. In the official Microsoft documentation, Microsoft instructs you to copy this folder from the DVD onto your file server. After copying the folder, you should then share the folder. And, using group policy, point all of your Windows Server 2012 servers to the share. Once this is done, you are then able to install roles and features onto servers that have had their payloads removed. However, I have found that this does not always work. In fact, on a lot of servers, I have found this very difficult to get working indeed. For that reason, I would advise against copying the SXS folder from the DVD. I would recommend that you use the local WinSXS folder from one of your Windows Server 2012 servers to create the feature file store instead. I will now eject my Windows Server 2012 R2 installation DVD from this server, and will then open the C drive and the Windows folder. If I scroll down through the list of folders, notice that we have the folder WinSXS. If you recall, this is the local side-by-side store for this server. This is the folder I recommend you use to create your feature file store, rather than the SXS folder from the DVD. To create a feature file store, I will right-click on the WinSXS folder and select Properties. From the Properties window that opens, select the Sharing tab, and then press the button Advanced Sharing. Next, tick the Share this folder checkbox, and enter a share name for the folder. The folder is now shared. To configure permissions to the folder, click the Permissions button. By default, the group Everyone has read-only access to all new shares. Microsoft recommends that, as a best practice, you remove the Everyone group and limit access to only the users and computers that need access. So I will select the Everyone group and will click the Remove button to remove the permissions. I will then click the Add button to add new permissions. For this particular share, user account access is not sufficient. Instead, Microsoft recommends that you add the computer accounts for all servers that need access to the feature file store. To do this, I will click the button Object Types, and will then tick the checkbox for Computers, and will then click OK. Since it is my Server 1 server that requires access to this file share, I will add the computer account for Server 1. Since the data in the feature file store only needs to be read and not changed, read-only access is sufficient. So I will click the OK button and will close all windows and return to my desktop. With the feature file store set up, the next step is to create a group policy to direct my Server 1 server to this share. So I will open Charms and will open Group Policy Management. At the top of the tree, I will right-click on my techtipsfromwill.co.uk Active Directory domain and will select Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. Of course, you could do this further down in the tree structure for an organisational unit if you prefer. For now, I will name this group policy WinSXS and will click the OK button. The WinSXS group policy has now appeared directly under my domain. To configure the group policy, right-click on it and select Edit. From the Group Policy Management Editor dialog box, navigate to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, System, specify settings for optional component installation and component repair. From here, select the Enabled Radio button. Further down, notice that we have a field, Alternate Source File Path. This is where you should enter the path to the feature file store share that contains the payload information. In my case, this is /DC1/WinSXS. Below this, we have a couple more options. Never attempt to download payload from Windows Update. By default, if Windows cannot contact the file share, if the file server is down for example, it will instead attempt to download the payload files from Microsoft's update servers on the internet. This is very handy, but does, in some respects, defeat the purpose of removing the payload for added security. If you tick this checkbox, Windows Update cannot be used as a source for obtaining payload files. If the network share is unavailable, the install will fail. It is up to you to decide whether this is good or bad for your organization. To prove that my feature file store is in fact working, I will tick this option to rule out any possibility that the payload files were downloaded from the internet. The last option, contact Windows Update directly to download repair content instead of Windows Server Update services, will essentially bypass a WSUS server if you have one, and will contact Windows Update directly to obtain the payload files. If the WSUS server is on a slow network connection, for example, you may wish to tick this checkbox. With the group policy configured, I will click OK, and will close the Group Policy Management Editor. Lastly, I will enforce the WinSXS group policy by right-clicking the policy and selecting Enforced. The feature file store and group policy are now configured, so I will now change back to my Server 1 server. Before I attempt to install a role using the feature file store, I will need to ensure that group policy is up to date on this server. So I will open a command prompt and will issue the command gp update /force. After a short wait, both the computer and user policies will have been updated. I will now close the command prompt and will return to my desktop. Next, I will reopen Server Manager and will select the Add Roles or Features link. From here, I will next my way to the Select Server Roles page. I will, this time, select the Hyper-V role, and will next my way to the end. Since the payload files are still absent from the local side-by-side store, notice that the warning message, one or more installation selections are missing source files, is still appearing, which is to be expected. Without specifying an alternate source path, I will now click the Install button. The Hyper-V role will now start to install. At this point, Server 1, using group policy, is obtaining the binary files it needs from the feature file store on DC1. After a short wait, the installation of the Hyper-V role will complete. As you can see, the installation of the role was successful, and the server is now asking for a reboot to complete the installation. proving that the payload information was successfully obtained from DC1. This concludes this tech tip on features on demand. I hope you have enjoyed this tech tip and found it informative. For more tech tips from Will, check out our YouTube page. And remember to support these videos by liking and commenting on them, and by subscribing to our channel. Many thanks, and we'll see you on the next tech tip.